everyone? Okay, good. Okay, I would like to say a few words to introduce tonight's speakers. The first speaker, Mr. Jon Price, or Professor Jon Price. Jon Price was appointed as Chief Executive of the Centre for Low Carbon Futures in November 2009 and is joined on the board by 5 Vice-Chancellors of member universities. Jon has attended a number of international forums on climate change, gaining experience of both leading and convening research projects in the EU, China, India, Japan and Latin America. He has acted as an expert advisor on policy and technologies to a broad range of public sector organisations, whilst predominantly working with international governments and British Embassy climate change and energy teams. Jon is currently the chair of the Leeds Sustainability Institute Steering Group, member of the Doctoral Training Centre in Low Carbon Technologies at the University of Leeds, and has previously acted as external reviewer for professional appointments at the University of Sheffield. Our second speaker is Peter Styring. Peter Styring is Professor of Chemical Engineering and Chemistry at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He also holds an additional chair in public engagement at the university. Peter is a chartered engineer and a chartered chemist and is a fellow of both the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Institute of Chemical Engineers. Peter is director of the CO2 Chem network based in the UK and is managing director of CO2 Chem Media and Publishing. He is also a member of the European Task Force on Carbon Dioxide Reuse. Peter's research is primarily carbon dioxide utilisation through the development of new catalysts and processes and the development of new carbon dioxide capture agents. He is also interested in CO2 policy and public perception. So, very impressive bios. I'd like to first invite Jon Price to start tonight's lecture. Jon, please.
You had a few slides on here. Did you want to do them?
I think I probably do. It shows I'm a new...
You've got a few of these things.
It shows I'm a new chairman, doesn't it? Yeah? Okay.
Do you need to do any of them?
No, I'm going to go straight into you, Jon, this time. I'm going to take advantage of the new position.
I'll do them for him. Okay, so lots of events. Let's get to mine. So, thank you very much. I do like that Welsh accent. It makes a very good chair, doesn't it? And congratulations on becoming chair 2 hours ago. My name is Jon Price from the Centre for Low Carbon Futures. Thank you very much all for coming along today. I had a quick chance to speak to some of you over the coffee just now. So I've got an understanding of where some of you are coming from, and some from Germany as well. So it's good to see. So I look after an organisation, very privileged to look after an organisation of mainly Russell Group universities in the UK, on the board with the vice-chancellors of each of those institutions. And one of the many things we're looking at, one of the many things that keeps us awake at night at universities is the impact of student fees. And I'm sure that also impacts students about to go to university in the UK. They've gone up tremendously. And universities are becoming more responsible now for making sure that their research has impact. And each year, that level of impact has to increase. So it's not just impact in terms of academic journals, it's also about impact of our research, not only into policy formation, but also into production. So one of our huge challenges is really taking science into production. And we've chosen to look at one particular sector, and that sector is, well, if you can call it a sector, a theme around carbon. And carbon covers many things. It can cover all aspects of climate change and aspects of energy. And today, we mainly speak about energy. And our group looks at a variety of technologies from carbon capture and storage from one end, all the way through to the improved breeding of crops and impacts of biofuels at the other end, and many technologies in between. I wanted to take the chance today, and thanks very much for the kind invitation from IMEC to be here tonight, and thank you to Tim, I think, who suggested that we should attend. And I want to very much talk about an alternative view of carbon. We're very familiar with the carbon capture and storage story within the UK, and we wanted to look at an alternative. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Professor Peter Styring, who we worked very closely with in the last year or so. When did we do that report, Peter? 2011. So a couple of years ago, we did a report. And it's quite strange with research. You do a lot of work in research, and then sometimes it's a couple of years later before it gets into the public attention. I think we're in that sort of phase now with this. So Peter's going to do the majority of the presentation. So I'm going to do some of the explanation for some of the non-experts in the room. And let's see how that goes. So in the UK, specifically, we have an energy issue. And there's a very broad variety of what these issues are. We've got a statutory decarbonisation target by 2050 at one end. And we've also got to balance that with a cost of energy, increasing cost of energy, which people are seeing more now on a monthly basis as their bills arrive on the doormat at home. But also balance that against the security of supply. Now, the CO2 debate that we've been having in the UK and across the United Nations countries has been going on for many, many years. And the issue I want to talk to you all about today is the fact that we openly recycle metals, plastics and wood. So why don't we recycle carbon? And this is going to be the essence of our talk today. And one of the reasons for that is because whilst the world is going down the route of chasing carbon capture and storage as one of the major solutions to reduction of carbon in the interim before we can convert to alternative technologies, there is a harsh practical reality that CCS is in fact a very huge cost burden, not only on the public but also on the private purse. And there's lots and lots of barriers as to why CCS hasn't really taken off in the way perhaps which it was perceived a few years ago. And one of those reasons is also because the language we use around carbon is also very confusing. And depending on your country, I think, Mike, you'll recognise the valorisation, I think is how the French use the term. CDU, which Peter will talk about, transformation, carbon utilisation, carbon conversion, and CCR, Peter? Reuse, carbon capture and reuse, all types of different language around this. And Peter's going to try and talk to you a little bit about the type of language which I think we're coming to some general agreement on now, which we start using. So once we have the language right, it's far easier to move ahead. But what is utilisation? Well, I'm here to say that the scope is absolutely huge and that Peter's going to give you lots of examples of where this can work. So we can go from urea to plastics to chemical feedstocks to fuels to polymers. So there's a huge opportunity within utilisation. But behind that opportunity is also a huge controversy. There's a controversy about CCS, but there's also a controversy about carbon utilisation or carbon dioxide utilisation. And much of that is around the fact we're using energy to make energy. And there's a huge energy cost around utilisation or conversion. So there's very distinct camps in the academic world, and I think also within industry. Those that would favour CCS, those that have some time for utilisation. And we're not here to say that utilisation is a solution, but it could be part of a solution. And that solution can work in very different situations. Notably, as an option where there are no other options. So, for example, if you're 1,000 miles inland with a steel plant in India, how can you get transportation to storage sites for carbon? And if you want security of supply, and you've chosen as a country not to go down the route of carbon capture and storage, where Germany was, I don't know if it still is, but I think that we had a situation in Germany where they didn't want to go ahead with nuclear or CCS. So then what do you do? And that's a lot of that is around public perception. So it's not just the technology. We sometimes refer to CO2 as supercritical. And for many, that sounds a bit strange. It sounds like a bomb or something dangerous. You don't really want a supercritical CO2 pipe going underneath your house. So you very like to say no if asked. Do you want to have one of these under your house? You'd probably like to say no. And I think that's the situation which has arisen to some extent in Germany. So my last couple of slides, I just wanted to mention, well, why is this important? Well, one of the reasons it's important is because, well, according to the World Bank report a couple of months ago, there's now up to 60 in place or emerging carbon emissions or trading schemes around the world. So if you're in the business of an energy-intensive industry, pulp, paper, steel, aluminium, oil and gas, and there's a financial imperative for you to reduce your carbon, and you can't store it, or you've got no access to a storage site, what else can you do? And if you're not in a country like China, where you're building cluster industrial parks, where there are some economies of scale linking up for transportation from your source to your sinks, then what do you do? And the extent of that is quite huge. Now, this chart is a little bit out of date, but it represents about 1% of UK GDP, which is the main industries within the UK. So on the left, we're seeing the impacts of sort of lime, the lime process. The clinker process within cement is one of the most energy-intensive processes, closely followed by in steel. And one of the facts about steel production is you're going to be using CO2. So a lot of industries are going to be impacted by increasing legislation. And a lot of these industries are involved in exports. So it's not just if you've got regulation in your own market, it's also if you've got regulation in other markets as goods pass across different borders. So the issues are clear and present. If you don't have an alternative to storage, what can you do? And if storage isn't really taking off as it was planned to do, and there are signs that things are slowing down, then what is your alternative? Now, having posed the question, what I'm going to do now is to pass over to my colleague, Professor Peter Styring, to help take you through some of those answers. Peter, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks for the invitation from the IMechE to talk about this today. I'm trying not to put too much chemistry in there. I'm trying to talk about concepts and the landscape. I'm going to talk about CDU. And as John said, the abbreviations and nomenclature, it's a little bit confusing at the moment. A little bit about the CO2 Chem network, because this is something that we want every discipline to feed into. We have lawyers, we have psychologists, we have mechanical engineers. It's meant to be a whole approach across the whole industry and the whole academia. And then I want to talk about storage, energy storage, and how CDU fits in. And of course, public perception is going to be key to this. And I was at the European Commission last week, and it was very clear that they want to get this right because Germany got it wrong. They referred to carbon dioxide in German as überkritischen Kohlendioxid, which translates to highly dangerous carbon dioxide. And of course, the public didn't like that. So carbon dioxide utilisation, that's the term we've settled on at the moment because there is so much debate. The problem is the European Commission have settled on carbon dioxide reuse under Horizon 2020. And we're now in a negotiation phase with the Commission to try and redefine that. And in fact, we've just got an FP7 grant, which is called Carbon Dioxide Transformation, so you can see where the confusion starts. It's utilisation because we're taking carbon and we're breaking carbon to oxygen bonds. So when you put carbon dioxide into the process, it comes out as something different. And that's different to EOR, that's different from CCS. And the reason for CDU, carbon dioxide utilisation, is there is a new international journal called Carbon Dioxide Utilisation, and the international conference, the flagship conference, is called the International Conference on Carbon Dioxide Utilisation. And therefore it seems sensible to have a global standard. So we're capturing carbon dioxide and we're transforming it into something. You may or may not require the carbon dioxide to be separated. In most cases you will. If you don't, the capex is substantially reduced because a huge proportion of the energy expenditure is in the capture process. It allows local utilisation, and therefore the extensive infrastructure for transportation is eliminated. And John's very clearly shown how that is applicable throughout the world. But even in the UK, if you notice all the CCS projects, they're on the East Coast. And that's because there are good storage facilities in the North Sea. So if you take Tata Steel in Scunthorpe, for example, that can put a pipeline into the North Sea at relatively low cost. If you're in Port Talbot, there's no storage facility there. So that becomes an issue. It allows for better energy integration and using CO2 as a commodity and not a waste. And CCS is using CO2 as a waste. There's no value in that product. So you can get profit from value-added products, and that can help offset or pay for the costs of the capital expenditure for capture. The problem is, where do you capture the carbon dioxide from? Ideally, you want to do that from the atmosphere, but the concentrations are low. Currently, 400 ppm, which is only 50 ppm below the critical limit identified by the IPCC, but it's still chemically and in terms of process quite low concentrations. Post-combustion capture is the key target because that's typically around 10%, up to about 15%. It can also be present in natural gas streams, so separating from methane is a possibility. Underground wells, the issue there is just don't touch them. They're there, they're stored, don't move them. So you don't want to do anything there. There's lots more carbon dioxide to use. Fermentation processes would be very, very useful because once you strip out the water, you're talking about near 100% composition. The problem is that is food grade and that goes into the food industry. So Coca-Cola will take that and Cadbury Schweppes. So that market is totally saturated. And then you have other processes, and the steel industry is one of the key ones, and we're working closely with Tata Steel on areas of carbon capture. So just something about the CO2 Chem network. It's an EPSRC Grand Challenge network established in 2010. Currently, we have 590 members. Hopefully, by the end of tonight, that will top 600. It's approximately 80% from the UK. It was set up as a UK organisation, but it's now become the biggest CDU, carbon dioxide utilisation network in the world. So at the moment, it's 20% from the world. By the end of the conference in Washington in 2 weeks' time, that will have significantly changed the demographics. It's interesting to look at the population. If you looked at it in terms of people, the highest number is from academia. If you looked at it in terms of individual institutions, then industry has the highest membership. So 46% of the membership are industrial companies. The 46% are things like Centre for Low Carbon Futures and ICME, IMECE, NGOs and government as well. We have a website which members have access to, a members database, which gives information about other members and possible collaborations. And we aim to make you money. The membership is free. We run free conferences, well, essentially free conferences. But we also put money into the system. So we have seed corn grants where we can fund collaborations between universities and industry, which lead to an outcome. We also identify different funding streams. So, for example, the CO2 Chem network led to an FP7 proposal between the UK, Norway, France, Belgium, which had a €2 million funding announced recently. Scott Consortium, again, 4 nations, €2.6 million recently announced. And we have other examples of high profit grants. We have set up 8 different clusters within the CO2 Chem network because we realised we couldn't cover everything as a whole network. So you can see there are fuels in there, biotransformations, public perception, systems approaches, so looking at the whole process. So this is process engineering and life cycle analysis. Carbon capture, because new carbon capture agents are required. Electrochemical transformations have been identified by Saudi Aramco as one of the key technologies in the next few years. And chemical transformations covers just about everything that's not covered there elsewhere, including polymers. How important is this? Well, the World Economic Forum identified CDU as one of the top 10 emerging technologies for 2012. And certainly, since we started at Sheffield working in carbon dioxide utilisation in, I think, 2006, it was a trickle of research. It's now grown exponentially, so it's become a worldwide phenomenon. And you can see from that quote from the World Economic Forum that one of the main targets is high-value hydrocarbons. And that will include kerosene for aviation, A1, aviation fuel. It will include diesel and petrol. But also new building blocks, so new C1 chemistry. And there's a drive at the moment for a partnership between us and a biochemical network to look at biological C1 chemistry. Economic viability, John touched on this. CCS, I got into trouble by saying CCS is an economic loss. Techno-economically, it is a loss. You have to put a lot of expenditure in to deal with the waste. Socio-economically, there are benefits in that you're creating jobs, you're providing industry with jobs to make the plant, and also you're reducing health risks because of reduction of acid gases. But on the whole, it's going to be a loss-making process. EOR will give you a short-term economic gain. Environmentally, it depends where you set the boundaries for the life cycle analysis, but it's not, we don't consider it to be an environmentally benign process, that it's not a sequestration process, it's an oil generation process, and that oil will eventually be burned. So it does give you that economic gain and a social gain. CDU offers some different aspects. I put down there point source capture because that's the highest concentration, but you can also look at air capture. It allows local storage, so you can imagine having a capture unit on a farm and the farmer being able to capture CO2, use renewable energy, and produce diesel to run the farm equipment. So it gives you that locality for energy supply. It also allows for diverse chemical production, and I'll just give you a flavour of some of the things you can do. And it certainly has an economic gain. It depends on the process, but typically the process to make a chemical from CO2 will pay off the expenditure within 2 to 5 years, in which case the plant is operating at a profit after that time. In the long term, air capture is going to be essential. John mentioned we've worked together with the Centre for Low Carbon Futures. This was a document that was published in 2011. And it started off small, but now has reached quite phenomenal levels. It's discussed at the European Commission. It's one of the key documents that fed into the Carbon Counts report to the European Commission. And it was funded by the Centre for Low Carbon Futures, and it set the scene for 2011. A very, very focused document at that time. There are plans now to write a new one, which will bring energy storage into the picture. But this really has set the scene, and it's put the UK on the map for carbon capture and utilisation. There are always people who say thermodynamics will not allow this to be profitable, that there needs to be an energy expenditure and you're using energy to create energy. But what you're doing is you're using carbon dioxide as an energy vector because you're creating more useful energy from energy sources which have less value. And if you look at carbon dioxide, it sits quite low in the thermodynamic well. It's down at around minus 400 kilojoules per mole, delta G. You can go to things like formic acid. So formic acid, very little difference in energy, but then again, you don't get a lot of energy out of it. It's good as a hydrogen store, and that's where carbon dioxide originally was used as a utilisation agent. What you really need to go to is higher energy density. And you can see methanol, which is one of the key targets for Northern European countries, is a reasonable intermediate between formic acid and the higher hydrocarbons such as kerosene and diesel. But those are really the target molecules. These are transportation fuels, which mean you don't have to change the transportation engines. So it's easier to redesign a fuel than it is to redesign a whole engine. So to get from carbon dioxide to the higher hydrocarbons, you need to add energy. Now, my background's in chemistry, so I'm looking at this from a different perspective. How do you do that transformation? If you look at it, instead of energy density, in terms of average carbon oxidation state, you get the same picture. So hydrocarbons are up here, carbon dioxide's down there. You've got to get from there to there. So you've got to add energy, and that energy is in the form of electrons. So you're putting electricity into the system to go essentially from +4 oxidation state to about -3. So that's a 7 electron transfer. You have to get 7 electrons of energy, and they have an energy penalty. It's also interesting to look at the energy density in terms of the volumetric as opposed to the gravimetric energy density. And a lot of people have said grow trees. Okay, trees are down here, very low volumetric and gravimetric energy density. Converting renewable energy into batteries, battery energy, is probably one of the worst. It's down here, very low volumetric, very low gravimetric density. So those are good for local applications, but not for global applications. There's been a lot of talk of the hydrogen economy. So hydrogen is up here. So standard conditions, it's got a very low volumetric density, but a high gravimetric density, which means if you want to fly a plane, there's a lot of energy there, but you need to take the whole fuselage as a storage tank. And Boeing have flown a 747, which the whole fuselage was the storage tank. And there wasn't a pilot because, surprisingly, no pilot wanted to get into that plane. So it was driven as a drone plane. So that has no real commercial application. Planes are not going to fly on hydrogen. So what you need to do is get up here to the gasoline, kerosene, and diesel. So that's the rationale for the conversion. And we need to use alternative energy sources. It's this old argument about how do you transfer from one energy form to another. You're using energy to create energy, but what we're proposing is using renewable intermittent supplies at times of low demand. So, for example, solar. It's very useful. It's intermittent, certainly in this country. It's also geographical. So it's possibly useful in African environments, for example, where there is a high light intensity, which is too high to use in stuff like algae cultivation. There's also wind. Again, it's intermittent. It's not really geographical, although if you go to Denmark, they're putting a lot of their energies into wind power. Having been in Roskilde recently, the wind blows in every possible direction, every possible minute of the day. There is a lot of wind energy, and they have an overcapacity for wind. So they can take the off-peak electricity from wind and convert it into electrons, which then convert it into fuel. Tidal is predictable, but again, geographical. It would be excellent for the UK, not so good for Switzerland. Hydro, very useful in Norway. Nuclear, political. Germany is going for no carbon capture and storage, and also no nuclear. The problem with nuclear is it's also a constant output, and therefore you don't really go through any big changes in demand. Geothermal, again, is geographical, but there's a company called Carbon Recycling International in Reykjavik who are using geothermal energy to make methanol, and it's very, very efficient. They use carbon dioxide from the volcanoes, they use the heat from the geothermal, they make a lot of methanol, but there's no market in Iceland for methanol. So they then ship it at high transportation costs to the Netherlands. So again, it's this issue of local versus remote supply and demand. The commonality between all those, with the exception of geothermal, is that you're producing electrons. So if you can produce electrical energy, you're producing electrons, which can then be converted into chemical energy. So it's a way of buffering intermittent power generation, getting chemical energy from electrical energy. The transportation losses on electricity are incredibly high. It's a lot easier to transport a liquid or a gas. We have the infrastructure, we have the pipelines. It's a lot easier to store, and it's a lot easier to transport. And there is a value-added product from a renewable resource. And just to put that into context, there's the sun. Its energy can be captured using a photovoltaic, and modern photovoltaics operate at around 20% efficiency or over. A plant, a normal living plant, is in the range 0.1 to 2% efficiency. That's going from light energy to chemical energy. A typical crop, 1 to 2%. Sugarcane, at its peak, will produce produce sugars at around 8% efficiency. So, if we look at this in terms of renewables, solar to electricity is around 20%. A chemical reaction to give methanol by hydrolysis, you're using the electricity to hydrolyze the water to give hydrogen, which then reacts with the carbon dioxide to give methanol, 70% efficiency. That gives you a total combined efficiency of 10 to 15%. So that is much higher now than a plant. So this technology is actually working better than photosynthesis, better than nature. And the timescales are different as well. You know, this can be done in a matter of hours, whereas a plant will take days. Mechanical energy from wind turbines. You're talking about something like 59% total theoretical wind power from a turbine. If you combine that with the chemical synthesis to methanol, you're looking at 41% efficiency. So over 4 times more efficient than a plant for the same conversion. So the problem with this is the intermittency and the synchronization to peak power demand. But at times of low demand, the electricity is wasted. Rather than having overcapacity, the turbines are switched off. So here's the ideal situation. You take a wind turbine, you take a solar panel, and out of it, you get a fuel. So that, you might think, is an ideal situation. That's the reality. So that is petrol. And if you don't believe it, you can come and have a quick sniff at the end. It smells like petrol. We've not got much of this. We're going to do a video and put it on our website soon where we're going to put it on a tissue and burn it to show that, you know, it's combustible. But that's from air fuel synthesis in Darlington. And that's done on a small demonstrator plant. But it shows that you can take carbon dioxide and convert it into fuel. And they're aiming at the high-end market. So they're aiming at supercars. They're looking at Formula One as a possible target. But in terms of publicity, that's great, because if you can get renewable fuels into Formula One cars, that's going to do a huge amount of good for the industry. Very briefly, the number of things you can look at are huge. There's fuels, there's intermediates, there's polymers. The things at the top are the ones that we as CO2 Chem are looking at. That's where there's an actual transformation. What we're not looking at is supercritical carbon dioxide, enhanced oil recovery, or the food industry. Because in these, you put carbon dioxide into the system and carbon dioxide is emitted at some stage. In the food industry, you know, it goes into your bottle of Coke, pressure of 7 bars, so half a litre of Coke contains about 6 grams of carbon dioxide until you open the top, and then it's all dissipated back into the atmosphere again. So carbon dioxide in, carbon dioxide out is not in our remit. For those with a liking of chemistry, those are some of the possible products. This is just a snapshot. These are some of the things that were proposed in 2011. Things are changing at a huge rate. And I've updated this slide recently to show the box structures. Those are technologies for which there is a current commercial market. So those are in production. And probably the biggest one is urea. That's been done for years. And urea is one of those chemicals which has a dual personality. It's been claimed to be the best chemical ever made because it's managed to feed the masses. It's also been called the devil chemical because because of the production of that it has led to a huge increase in human population. So that is a huge market and it's saturated. Cyclic carbonates are good because you can use those as replacement solvents for volatile organics. So that makes the process greener. It's also made from carbon dioxide. So it's made from carbon dioxide and it will also capture carbon dioxide. So it has a dual role. Polycarbonates, there's a polycarbonate. I've got a photo of it later. That is 50% carbon dioxide by weight. It looks nothing like carbon dioxide, but it shows that carbon dioxide can be captured and you can hold it. And I was talking to an oil directorate recently, and they said, well, that's not storage. You know, you're not storing carbon dioxide there. And I said, well, that's been in my pocket for a year now, and it hasn't changed. And he said, but you know, at the end of the process, you're going to burn it, or you're going to send it to landfill. And I said, well, what are you going to do with your oil? So it's a matter of usage and perceptions. You know, I perceive that to be a good storage tool. So those are a few examples. Polymers are, apart from fuels are a huge market. Mineralization is another big market. So the cement industry, making low-carbon cement. But polymers are a huge market. And one thing to notice here is that the three companies involved, Bayer, Evonik, and BASF, are all based in Germany. And that's because Germany, as I said, put a stop to carbon capture and storage, and all the money was diverted into carbon dioxide utilisation. So 100 million euros has gone into a 3-year programme. And out of that, you've got polyurethane, which is used in BMW upholstery and soundproofing. You've got elastomers made by Evonik. And the thing that I showed there was polycarbonate, which is, you know, that's a token for shopping trolleys. But, you know, it has a use. It's permanent storage. That's actually made in collaboration with Siemens, who are not only the supplier of energy through the wind turbines, but also use this polymer in their vacuum cleaners as one of the components. And polycarbonates are used for construction materials and also security glass, so bulletproof glass. So there's a big market there. In the UK, I'm part of something called 4CU, which is an EPSRC grant, which is £5.7 million over 4 years. And the target of this is to convert carbon dioxide into fuel. And there are lots of groups working on this throughout the world. But we're looking at, it's an integrated program between 4 universities. And we're looking at separations using advanced processes and also using novel adsorbents. So designing adsorbents that will be more effective and more cost-effective to run. We're looking at syngas production by electrocatalytical methods, and that has been shown, or it's been proposed that that's one of the key technologies for the near future. Looking at syngas production by plasmolysis, which is more blue sky research. We're looking at alternative Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. So this is not the conventional Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, and that is through new catalyst design. And that includes molecular modeling, computer simulations to design the catalysts using ab initio methods. And we're also looking at direct conversion using, again, novel catalyst design. You'll see there it's got SP3 up to 7. SP1 is the technological modeling, so that's the process simulation. SP2 is the life cycle analysis. That underpins everything. Public perception is, as I said, very important. Life cycle analysis is also important. Very few of the processes that are proposed look at the life cycle analysis. They propose chemical transformations, but they don't look at the whole picture. we're trying to come up with some figures of merit, and we're working with the psychology department in doing public perception surveys on this. Thomas Muller from Aachen University proposed this figure of merit for carbon dioxide utilisation. And it takes 3 metrics. It takes the amount of carbon dioxide fixed, so that's the net amount, that's the amount fixed minus the amount produced in the fixation process. The duration of fixation, so for example, cement will have a long duration of fixation, whereas kerosene is going to be relatively short. But then, if you capture it again, it becomes part of the carbon cycle. It also looked at value generation, so looking at high-value products that will add to the economy of the process. At the same time he was doing that, we were working on something similar, and we came up with this 4-metric system because we noticed something else as well. And that was market capacity, which was not covered in this. Using this model, the investigators showed that the most viable product was salicylic acid. It's made from phenol plus carbon dioxide. Salicylic acid is the base material for aspirin. So they said that was the most profitable compound that you can make. So effort should be diverted into, it was the Colby-Schmidt process to make aspirin. But we pointed out the market capacity for that is not there. If you take the Veolia energy from waste plant in Sheffield, which takes municipal waste, converts it into combined heat and power, if you take a 10% slipstream of the CO2 emitted and convert all of that into salicylic acid, in 1 year, you produce the global annual demand for salicylic acid. And that puts things into context, because this carbon dioxide utilisation is not going to be the answer to mitigation. It's going to be a driver in the economics of mitigation, and there are various estimates as to how much it will contribute. The common perception is that 10% of carbon dioxide emitted can be used in chemical production. And Martin Polyakov from the University of Nottingham actually put this into context very well. If you took all the carbon dioxide emitted, and we're talking teratons per annum, and you converted that into chemicals, you would be knee-deep in chemicals. It's that big a volume of gas you're dealing with. So we're working, with, as I said, with the psychology department to look at various aspects of the process. And this is going to be presented in Washington next week, looking at how we can influence the public and how we can gauge the public's view. And this is just a spider chart showing an extension of that work on using different metrics. And in this case, we've just chosen 3: CCS, aspirin production, and synthetic liquid fuel. And the idea is that for the spider chart, we're trying to populate all the outer rings. What this does is it allows us to identify, firstly, which processes are likely to succeed now, and also where the pinch points in any process is going to be. So, for example, in synthetic liquid fuels, part of the problem is sustainable feedstocks, because hydrogen becomes part of that. Sustainable catalysts, for synthetic liquid fuels, iron is a good catalyst, so that fits in quite nicely there. Energy efficiency, there's a lot of energy transfer involved, so for that, by using renewables, we can push it out there. But it's important to get the views of the public. It's important that we educate them now about how carbon dioxide utilisation can improve their quality of life in terms of sustainability of energy supply, security of energy supply, and also income generation. I've had several meetings with Nick Clegg about carbon dioxide utilisation. The first meeting was a complete disaster, and he said we can't do anything about carbon dioxide utilisation until carbon dioxide is adopted as a technology. So head in the sand approach. Second meeting was, I mentioned the fact that you can make a profit and the GDP would be positively affected, and then he started to take interest. Third meeting, he's showing a lot of interest and he's supporting the programs and working to get us working with DEC. The issue was highlighted in France. Of this survey, it was a large survey, but 6% of over 15s surveyed didn't know what CCS technology was. However, 59% of them, of the whole group, were in favour of CCS. They then went on to an education programme where they were told about the CCS technology, but they focused on the negative aspects. That 59% fell to 38% approval. So the public has got to be well educated, but it's got to be ethically educated, and they have to know all the pros and cons of the process. In terms of the perspectives, there have been several, this is data taken from Frost & Sullivan, but presented by Saudi Aramco. And they've identified none of these technologies as being mature. Everything is in an early stage of development, so it's in the growth phase. But electrochemical and reduction, so things like Fischer-Tropsch, are up there as being reasonably well advanced and providing relatively good market value. Things like plasma, they put down as the do not touch zone. And the reason for that was they're not commercially viable at the moment. They're all at a bench scale, laboratory scale. But maybe these are the areas which are going to attract a lot of attention in the future. And certainly from the CO2 Chem network, we've seen a lot of interest in low temperature plasmas as a way of producing chemicals. So to conclude, we see CDU as an essential part of the carbon capture portfolio. It's not an alternative. It's part of the whole picture. That includes CCS. It also includes EOR and EGR, because somehow you have to make a profit. Integration of the capture agents and catalysts is going to be key. I've not touched on that today, but at the moment, MEA is used as a solvent, and economically and environmentally, it's not a good solvent to use. If you can make some designer solvents where the catalyst is already incorporated, you can reduce the energy penalty, and we have examples where that does work. Energy integration of renewable intermittent sources is absolutely essential, and I think without that, the economics aren't going to stack up. It gives the opportunity for relatively low cost production, but also local production. And in terms of the Veolia plant in Sheffield, you could see the municipal waste coming in, going into the combined heat and power plant, some of that heat and power being used to produce carbon dioxide, to take the carbon dioxide and produce fuels, which are then stored locally at times of low demand, for example, during the summer when there's no demand on the heat, and then using it to power the collection fleet by making diesel. So there are possibilities there. Air capture is going to become increasingly important. China is the biggest emitter. What's emitted in China today will be hanging over London in 6 months' time because of air currents. So there is going to be a dilution effect from the point source, which means that you can capture at any non-geographically determined location. Public perception is key, and we also have to have life cycle analysis on all those processes that we look at. And Germany and Bayer Aachen are very, very, very advanced on doing that. A lot of this work was funded by the EPSRC in the UK, and also the Centre for Low Carbon Futures, who funded the initial report, which is the basis of a lot of this work. And finally, if anyone wants to join the network, I'll put a quick advertisement up there. Please do join. It's free, and it has benefits. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you both. very intriguing, thought-provoking use of carbon dioxide as opposed to our normal practice of sequestration. I'd like to open questions with Jon Phillips. Jon, there you go.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate the presenters on a fascinating subject. It certainly opened up my mind to this technology. The question I've got in the back of my mind, though, is more of an overall impact that this technology could have on the existing technologies that we have. One of the uses that you'll foresee is to convert the CO2 into fuel. At the moment, we're using oil-based products to produce the fuel. Now, how is that going to upset the markets? Because basically what we're looking at here is a major sea change. You're talking about vast volumes of CO2 that have the potential to be converted into fuel. Which is going to cause a significant collapse in the oil market, and then on the top of that has been in the press recently. There's talk of the carbon bubble. Now, this basically is all the money that's been invested, basically in hydrocarbons which are still in the ground. If we release that lot, there's no way in which we're going to prevent global warming. So we have an enormous stock of hydrocarbons that basically cannot be used. And adding this to that situation, I think is going to produce a real upset. Now, have you had any thoughts about how this could manifest itself?
Shall I start? Yeah. The answer is yes, we've had lots of thoughts about this. I was at a recent meeting of the Four Kingdoms Initiative, which was UK, Netherlands, Norway and Saudi Arabia. And actually the people who were most receptive to this were the Saudis, which I found quite surprising. In terms of how it will change the balance, it will... The aim, remember this was driven by EPSRC, so the frontmen for UK government research, in effect, was to produce a more stable energy supply, and in particular a more stable hydrocarbon energy supply. So it was to decrease reliance on fossil fuels from other regions, particularly unstable regions. In terms of using the hydrocarbons that are present naturally, the technology to recover those is getting increasingly more intense. So you're talking about enhanced oil recovery. If you, again, I have a student who's working on the life cycle analysis of this at the moment. In fact, Katie Armstrong, who's the network manager. And it depends where you set the boundary conditions for the life cycle analysis as to which is the more polluting. If you take, very simplistically, if you take carbon dioxide and convert it into, let's say, octane, for every one molecule of octane you produce, you use 8 molecules of carbon dioxide. When you burn it, you produce 8 molecules of carbon dioxide. So you have this nice cycle developing. If you take EOR and you look at the density of supercritical carbon dioxide, the process, so if it's a immiscible process, then 70% of the carbon dioxide injected is re-emitted. So you're only sequestering 30% of what you inject. Because of the difference in densities, the amount of oil that you produce is far greater than the amount, the number of carbon atoms in the oil that you produce is far greater than the number of atoms of carbon you sequester. So for every 1 tonne of carbon dioxide you sequester, if you look at the cradle-to-grave analysis, at the end of the process, you emit at least 7 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So this process, because it's targeting very specific molecules using very specific technology, it gives more of a carbon cyclic approach rather than a highly carbon-intensive approach. I hope that answers it. If John has anything to add.
I think I need to say I don't see it as being that disruptive to the petrol industry, to be honest with you. I think because of the amount of CO2 which can be reused, and we're saying that's somewhere between 1 and 10%, I think, of CO2, I don't think it's going to impact. I think we're going to have greater impacts from biofuels, second generation. So that's yeah. I'm not a futurologist, but I think the weight of the oil and gas industry and John Brown and the Global Energy Board will have quite a lot to say about that.
Okay, thank you.
Next question, please.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for your presentation. So, Tony Chio from Altran. So, I noticed that you mentioned that you are engaging with industry as well. So, I just wanted to know how do you do that? And looking at the number of topics that you investigate or studying, so do you have like a list that we can find out and sort of engage more with the sort of thing that you guys are doing? Thank you.
Okay, so how do we engage with industry? We're both active and passive. So we attend lots of meetings, we talk to lots of industry, but most of our industrial contacts come passively through people coming in through the website. So really, a lot of the interest was generated through the Carbon Capture in the Green Economy document. That's attracted global coverage. Because we published it as a small working document, but then the Global Institute in Australia picked up on it and then started publicising it, and it just sort of went viral from there. But in terms of industrial collaboration, it's usually the industry that comes to us. And as a centre, we act as a broker, if you like, because although it's based in Sheffield, the member organisations are huge. So we try and match up the companies to the technology the companies are interested in, to the expertise of other members. So, for example, we do a lot of work with Bayer because they've been members from the start. But I was out at Alstom in Switzerland, Germany last month talking to senior vice presidents about how this could be integrated into their portfolio. So you could think of CO2 Chem as an advocacy organisation as well as a research organisation.
If I can take that as well. So, Centre for Low Carbon Futures, I mentioned before, one of the big issues for universities is getting more science into production. I don't think universities today are very good at that. In cases they're excellent, but in the majority of the cases they're not. And I think there's probably more trust, I mean, you're from industry, in America with universities and industry than perhaps in the UK. And I'm not really sure if our business schools actually help that. I mean, perhaps our business schools, rather than talking about the business of business, they can talk about the business of the context of science and technology and a better translation. What we're trying to do in early stages is we don't talk to this as utilisation. We talk about this as an energy storage. And the way we take that to industry now is we talk about the issues around renewables and intermittency and peak demand on the grid. And in the UK, our grid was built in the 1950s when we last had money. That's a bit creaking now. We need to look at other aspects of energy storage and distribution and how we're going to feed in renewables into our grid. In other countries around the world, they have very different energy issues. So we talk to this as a collective energy storage, so that's our strong interest. And we take that to industry through a series of lectures. We work very closely with the FCO, Foreign Commonwealth Office, and the UKTI. We also have a number of interactions with industry through learning societies and learning societies in other countries. And we have a lot of groups like this engaging directly with industry, but we're looking specifically at industrial applications. Because behind all of this, that universities are also very interested in exploitation of IP. So we do have a good interest in that. We just need to get better as an industry, as a university group across the UK at doing that. So that's, I guess, work in progress.
Next question, please.
I've got a question.
Okay, and then the gentleman behind you. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Julian Jackson, an environmental journalist, and I've got one part of the process I didn't quite understand. If you're capturing carbon and then turning it into fuel, isn't it just going to go back into the atmosphere again?
Yeah, it is. But then you then do a recapture. So which is why air capture becomes important. So this is the carbon cycle, as it's called. The idea is that there are certain products that need to be maintained. Kerosene, diesel. There is still a huge market for that. And until a new transportation technology is developed which will cope with renewables, we need to maintain those, the supply of those materials. So yes, it is re-emitted, but it will be recaptured at a later stage. It's diverting. If you think of the good example is Denmark. Denmark have got a pledge that by, I think it's 2030, they're going to a zero fossil fuel-based energy economy. Now that is great, but how are they going to travel? That fossil fuel is still going to be in the economy. So it's the energy economy that's changing. The transportation economy is going to stay relatively the same. So what we're advocating is that CO2 utilisation goes into replacement fuels, which are near to carbon neutral because you're capturing the CO2. So for the fuel economy, it's going to be circular. It's not going to contribute to the sequestration, to the reduction of emissions. But if you take it to something like polymers, polymers are going to capture it. If you take it to mineralisation, so production of cement, production of aggregates, that is going to be a reduction. So there's a lot of trading. There are a lot of processes. Some of them will be in a cycle, some of them will be a reduction technology. But we're still talking anything from 1 to 10% on current estimations. So it's not going to be part of the big sequestration picture.
Thank you.
Gentleman behind you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Zim Lead Upstream Advisors. I'm just wondering about the oil and gas industry. And so far, you focused on enhanced oil recovery as one of the current uses of CO2 and how that has its disadvantages. I'm just wondering about high CO2 gas fields, which there are now a lot of them in the North Sea in terms of the CO2 content in some countries where they have stranded gas fields where there is no infrastructure to make use of the gas, whether carbon dioxide utilization could be a way of producing those gas fields as an alternative to LNG. So you might, for example, if the technology is compact enough to actually convert the CO2 into liquid fuels and export those. I don't know if you've done any work looking at the balance of that, whether that works thermodynamically, economically, in terms of using high CO2 fields.
No, I've got to be honest here and say we have not considered that at all. So can't really comment on that.
Well, thanks for the question.
But yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. We'll think about that.
This gentleman here. I'll come back to you. I'll come to you then.
Hi, Tim Parker from McLennan. Two relatively simple questions, I think. One, what's the sort of unit electricity consumption rate for this sort of transfer? And I guess the second question really is on what sort of level do you see this sort of technology happening? You mentioned the steel industry. Would you imagine this kind of technology being in place at the steelworks or at a more centralised collection point? So maybe the fuel can be used on site at the steelworks, or how scalable on an industrial sort of sense do you see this actually operating?
Okay, on the first question, I don't have any data on that, but that's certainly something that will become part of the life cycle analysis as it progresses, and I'll feed that in. On the second, when we first started discussing this in terms of integration of power, CO2 emissions, chemical production, we had power companies saying we don't want chemical plants on our site. And we had chemical plants saying we don't want to be on the power site. Things are starting to change. And certainly Tata Steel have a carbon capture unit on site in Rotherham where they're taking a slipstream from the flue gas and putting it into a bioreactor to produce fuel from using algae. In terms of other industries, this is too early a stage for it to be adopted. But if you look at Ferrybridge, for example, the Scottish and Southern Power Station, they have a 10-ton per day capture unit, which could feasibly make a significant impact in fuel production. So, like I said, for the Veolia plant, you could use that fuel to power the collection vehicles. In the same way that if you had the capture unit at Scottish and Southern feeding into a converter unit, it could fuel the trains that come onto site. It could fuel the vehicles on site. So, in terms of localised production and localised use, it just makes sense. In terms of the capital expenditure, most of the capital expenditure is in the capture unit. So if the capture unit's there, then it's a way of making use of what you've already invested in. So the conversion plant, we've done some design project with the undergraduate students where they've done calculations where the cost of the conversion plant is something like 25% of the capture unit, and it will pay back within, if you're making fuel, it will pay back within about 5 years. But the capture unit at Scottish and Southern at the moment captures the CO2 and then re-emits it, because there's no, the end of pipe is open. There's no pipeline to the North Sea. There's no production plant. So that is something where it would be quite easy to retrofit a chemical production plant onto it. And it doesn't have to be a sophisticated plant. If you're making aspirin, it's just a single reactor.
I think there's a big interest in the steel sector. I mean, it's one of the energy-intensive industries which is probably heart of most debate, because it's probably at the level of best available technology. So what else do you do in steel production to reduce your CO2? I think basically what I hear, that there's lots of enthusiasts in various steel mills which are thinking, well, we'll adopt this technology or this technology. But I think that really is very much down to enthusiasts and their views. I can't really see that being widely adopted. We've seen that with algae, for example, experience as well. I think where we're really envious is, and my colleagues at the British Embassy in Beijing would say that in the 5-year plan, which I've not read, but they have read, that they are talking about these sort of clusters, these new industrial parks in China which are evolving, the low-carbon provinces, where they are able to co-locate industries which make sense to share each other's waste. And I think in those applications there are some really good and large volume applications. It's going to be very difficult, for example, in the UK, because there's going to be winners and losers. We've got, I think, a lot of designs for a lot of different pipelines going to the North Sea for CO2, which I guess you're familiar with from the steel sector. And I think Tata missed out on one of these pipelines. It wasn't quite located clear enough to the pipeline. So if you're going to be located close to a pipeline or a method of capturing the volume of CO2, then you're going to be a loser. If you're close to it, you're going to be a winner. If you're in China and in a low-carbon province, well, that's probably utopia for this application.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman just there. Tim, I'll come to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
And thank you for an excellent lecture. A point you raised in the lecture, very close to my heart, was educating the public on schemes like this. I mean, in terms of the overall renewable situation, we do need to educate the public, given the total rubbish which is spoken about wind power and about other renewables, and the very slow positivity towards nuclear power stations, which, in my opinion, we don't need. But how would you go about educating Joe public? Are the universities looking to do something about this? Are you working with the institutions? And the second point to the question, when you met with Mr. Clegg earlier, was there a government technical mind in the room listening to what you said? I say that for obvious reasons.
So the latter question is very easy to answer. No.
Very sad.
No. There was he had an assistant present, that was it. But no, there was no technical input. In terms of educating the public, things like, you know, the BASF tokens that show a viable product, that will convince the public. You know, if they can see the polyurethane foam being used in a car, if they can see the fuel being used, air fuel synthesis, for example, use the petrol that they produce in a small motorised scooter, that they show the thing coming off the plant and then going straight into the scooter and someone riding around the factory forecourt in it. There has to be tangible products. Indeed. At the moment, it's, you know, CEU apparently started about 1971, and the driver for that was the oil crisis. And then it resurfaced again in the late 90s. Again, oil crisis. Now it's resurfaced because of the fuel security and also climate change. But it's growing, it's got more momentum now, and people are starting to appreciate the benefits. Germany have got a very strong public engagement program where they're showing the benefits of this. They've learned their lessons. The European Commission are certainly looking at public perception as one of the key drivers on Horizon 2020. They've got lots of money associated with technology, R&D, innovation, but they've also got money assigned to public perception. And the SCOT program that I know I mentioned has social scientists, psychologists, chemical engineers, chemists involved. So it's the whole portfolio, and one of the key aspects there is going to be public engagement. What are we doing now? We've recently commissioned 5 films to be made, 5-minute films, which are going to be published on the CO2 Chem website. And you know, if any institution wants to use those, we're quite open. They're going to be royalty free, and they're going to look at various aspects of carbon dioxide utilisation. The first one is going to be air fuel synthesis, petrol from CO2. The second one is going to be a film on public perception, directly aimed at increasing public knowledge. And the psychologists have come up with an interesting concept of top trump cards. So you have the carbon capture top trumps, where you talk to the public with a series of cards, and you rate each one in terms of their technical, social or economic viability.
Seems to me you've got an excellent aid already in every home, which John Logie Baird provided. And given the amount of rubbish reality TV we see, could we not inject a few 5-minute films on how people can understand this? Speaking English, of course, as opposed to detailed chemistry. I mean, why the institutions don't do this is beyond me.
What I didn't say in my bio was I spent 3 years as an EPSRC Senior Media Fellow, so did a lot of TV work. So and Sheffield has 3 former Senior Media Fellows, and we've just appointed a novice film producer who's done some very, very good films in her very short career to do these 5 short films. YouTube is there's a CO2 Chem YouTube channel. When I did my senior media fellowship, I had an interview for an extension with Lord Robert Winston, and I went into the meeting and I said, new media is the way forward. BBC 3, you might as well sit. BBC 4, you might as well sit in a broom cupboard and talk to yourself. And because Jimmy Al-Khalili did the Atom, which was a brilliant series, BBC 4 midnight on a Sunday. The BBC didn't make any DVDs of that. The only place you can get it is YouTube, where people have ripped it. And it's the way forward because, doing things for the BBC, you have a very limited market. Strangely enough, if you go over to Europe and BBC World Service, then they have some excellent programs on renewable technologies. And air fuel synthesis was on the second program of this recently, which I saw in Belgium, got back to the UK, and you can't access it because it's not covered by the licence fee. So the BBC is doing some brilliant stuff on carbon capture and utilisation, but Britain can't see it.
Not for UK.
I mean, if you could put it on BBC, say, after EastEnders, or ITV after Coronation Street, maybe even Mr. Clegg would watch it.
Just to vote on the position, maybe you have the microphone here, please, to Tim. And then we'll go one more question, and I think we call an end then.
Thank you. Tim Fox from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. Many things I could pick up on. It's really been a fascinating trot through CO2 utilisation. But what I want to do is just... and by the way, Mr. Clegg, Nick Clegg, he visited the air fuel synthesis plant on the day that the institution was running the story about taking CO2 and utilising it to make fuel. And he wrote in the visitor's book, I've glimpsed the future. So he has been and had a look at it. But basically, I wanted to pick up on this public perception issue. And it seems to me there are 4 narratives going on here. There's the narrative of using CO2 to close the carbon cycle through the atmosphere using air capture. There's the narrative of energy storage, potential use, make liquid fuels or some other energy-dense storage medium. There's a narrative around using the CO2 for energy security purposes. So, creating fuel where in a place where you might not have easy access to fuel. The final narrative, which I think might be the most interesting for the public, and I'd like your comments on this, is this recycling narrative. Because the public, thanks to a lot of the work we've done over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, are very, very au fait with this notion of recycling. This concept of recycling CO2, why not recycle it? I wanted to know if you've done any work looking at how many times you can recycle the CO2 relative to how many times you might recycle basic metals, for example, through this, or glass through recycling technology, to kind of get a sense about sort of the holistic view of once you've locked this CO2 into the system, say in your token example, how many times is that likely to get reused before it does end up back into the biosphere? And how does that compare relative to other recycling processes? And how would that affect public perception, possibly?
Okay. No, we've not looked at that. But in terms... If you look at the combustion process, then the limitation there is the air capture. So at the moment, we're talking about taking a fuel, be that municipal waste or coal or gas or whatever, and it's emitted at 15% concentration in nitrogen. You do the capture, which is relatively simple. You convert it into a fuel. It's then combusted. It goes into the atmosphere, and then it becomes harder to capture. So in that case, the recycling is quite short. It's just one recycle, in effect, unless we can get the air capture sorted out. And as I said, that has got to be done. There are some interesting concepts on air capture that are being discussed. So that could become a possibility. But something like the polycarbonate token, you're into normal plastic recycling at that stage. And what you do with it at the end of its life depends. It could go to landfill, which hopefully it wouldn't. It could go to reprocessing, which is a possibility. It could be used as a fuel in a combined heat and power unit, in which case you're back into the 15% emissions and capture. And it's an interesting point. Something else for Katie to look at.
Sorry, Katie.
Can I say as well, Tim? So thanks. I think that combines well with the earlier question as well about the roles of universities around this public perception. I think a number of our grants do give us some metrics around public perception, how many businesses we've spoken to, how many people we've given in-depth education to by attending seminars for more than 4 hours or something. But they're not really deep metrics for universities. And I think there is a huge opportunity for universities to do more of this. And I don't think we're currently doing it. And I think it's absolutely critical because we've seen what's happened in Germany, for example, around if you talk about science in a way which people don't really understand, you might get a different result. And I think, well, I know from close conversations with people in DEC, which are favouring new technologies in the UK, one of the big concerns is around public perception. And you can have some of the best technologies in the world, but if the public perception don't want it, then it's not going to happen. Yeah, so I think you're both on a similar area, and I think it's a huge role, and I think you're right. Sorry, I don't know your name at the back, but so what was your name at the back? Richard. So thank you, Richard. I think universities can do an awful lot more. There's a much bigger role for them to play.
Right, thank you.
Very, very quickly, what we would aspire to in terms of YouTube, I don't know if you've seen Video Elements.
Yes.
It's a very chemistry.
Very, very clever.
So that's Martin Polykoff and Pete Licence. Pete Licence is part of our management group, so involved in the public perception. They did Video Elements. They also did 60 Symbols, which is the physicist's version, where they put Martin Polykoff into an MRI scanner and did the professor's brain. So they've got some very, very innovative stuff. So Pete Licence is part of our team. So we would aspire to do that. I checked one on gold the other day, and it's been up on the internet for about 3 months, and it's had 3 million hits. So that's bigger than a BBC4 audience.
Maybe it's a university channel that we need, as you were saying about a university YouTube.
We've tried that.
Right, last question, please. Just direct around you, Tim.
Thank you both again for your interesting input there. One thing I was hoping you'd speak a little bit more about was the mineralization. I didn't hear much about that. Can you outline a little bit of, you mentioned market capacity, and that's huge on the fuel side, but what about mineralization, and just talk around the economics and any work that's going on in that area?
Do you want to start?
Well, I'll start. I know that it's, well, I'll go very short on this. There seems to be very large interest around this in Brazil. We've spoken about it in many other markets, and Peter will pick up on some of the issues around it. But Brazil, I think a lot of CO2 coming from the biomass from biofuels, which hopefully with greater enzymes will break down the cellulosic walls and will giving greater or better use of that biomass. But at the moment, there does seem to be a degree of interest in Brazil about mineralisation and construction. But I don't know if you want to add anything to.
Yeah, part of the SCOT programme is a company called Carmeuse in Belgium, who are cement producers. Lafarge are very interested in this area. The expert on mineralisation in the UK is a guy called Mike Priestnell, who heads up the mineralisation cluster. In the Green Economy document, we talked about mineralisation as one of the key technologies. It wasn't particularly what we're thinking about now. It was in that document. It talked about sequestration of CO2 in geological mineral formations. What we're now talking about, and it's certainly on the landscape for the European Commission, because one of the three areas of interest for Horizon 2020 are mineralisation, methanol and polymers. So mineralisation is well up there. the aim now is not to look at mineralisation as sequestration geologically, but mineralisation as sequestration in the built environment. So using mineralisation to produce construction materials which will give a lower carbon footprint to the current processes. So Portland cement is way up there on the list of deliverables under Horizon 2020. But if you're interested in that, I know nothing about mineral carbonisation. I took Mike Priestnall over to Brussels with me for that meeting. If you're interested in that, I can give you contact details, or join the network and we can put you in touch with him directly. Katie is very good at doing that.
There's media training coming too.
Good link. Sell.
Okay. Right, well, thanks very much. I'd like to ask Norman to give a vote of thanks. Norman, please.
Well, in my notes of this, two words pop out: education and perception. We started off with student fees, and then we ended up with educating the public. And in my early draft of promotion for this, I said this evil element, and I was using it to kind of attract attention. Well, it certainly attracted the attention of one of my co-fellows who said, it's not evil, it's got potential uses, which is exactly what our two speakers have shown to us tonight. CO2 is a commodity, CO2 to be recycled. Perhaps if I can be slightly critical, I would like to have heard a little bit more about what is in your report, where the plants are juxtapositioned. So you said minimizing the transportation, and yes, if you put the two plants together, you don't have any transportation. I don't know why the chemical companies and the power companies are so averse to one another, because I've said for many years that electricity is a byproduct of a chemical process. And if you think about it, that's exactly what it is, whether you're talking about coal or nuclear. So we've got to work on the perception of terms. Clearly, the Germans with this, what was it called, a highly dangerous carbon substance, didn't work very well for their people, but it's perhaps had the converse effect that Bayer and BASF are once more in the leadership of actually capturing it and holding it in a stable form. So I wonder if we should rename our stuff CDU. I was delighted to have you mention capture and air fuel synthesis, because our far-sighted theme manager, Tim Fox, we had a capture seminar here in this room last November. So I'd like very much to thank you both, two for the price of one, John and Peter. Before I ask you to give your thanks in the usual way, can I just give a plug to something we're doing on the next lecture in this series is on the future of coal. And somebody told me earlier on today that there's carbon in that as well, and I've learned a lot today. And that's on the 3rd of October. It's a free lecture. And then on the 16th and 17th, there is the now 6th annual Carbon Capture and Storage event. And we're very pleased to say that at the moment we have promises from the Minister of State, Michael Fallon, and the Shadow Minister, Tom Greatrex, to actually speak at that event, which obviously gives some recognition of the work that the IMECA has been doing on this. So without any further sales, although I think one of my colleagues here has been selling all night, I'd ask you to thank them in the usual way.